In this video, I will show you how to create a wall painting game mechanic using a custom shader graph in Unity. Hi, I'm Peter and welcome to Sunny Valley Studio Tutorials. I will be using a very simple starter project with some modular walls that we will be able to paint. There will be a first-person controller here, and basically this is a project using a universal rendering pipeline. So I have this universal RP installed here as well. So we are going to be able to use the shader graph. Now my wall prefab is using currently the default lit material from universal render pipeline. So what I can do is change the color of the walls, but this color changes immediately, and I would like to have this smooth transition between this color and the paint color that I want to apply. So I will create a custom shader graph. So I will right click, create, I will select shader graph, and I will select universal render pipeline and a lit shader graph, and I will call it paint wall. Okay, now my wall has specific texture as the base map, as well as some normal texture and a metallic map. So I want to preserve all of those, so I need to include them in my custom shader as well. So open your custom shader graph, and we are going to select first the blackboard. Make sure that you have it opened. It is a button in the top right corner of the shader graph window. If you have a problem with main texture like I have, simply select quad, for example, here, and we are going to see it. So now let's first recreate our basic look of the wall. So we need to implement a main texture as the base color, the normal map that I have, and the metallic map also that I have for this texture. So I will select my blackboard, select this plus icon, and I will need to add texture 2D for my base color. So I'll call this just MainTex. And I will create two more. One will be the normal map, and the second one will be the metallic map. Okay, so what we can do here is select our main text, drag it into our shader, and I will sample it. So let's just drag this red dot and type sample, because we always need to sample a texture. I will also create a UV node. Simply press spacebar and type UV, and you can select input geometry UV, and I will drag it as the input for my sample texture 2D. Also, this will be useful for our calculations. Now, as an example, I have my textures. I will select my main text, and in the graph inspector, I will be able to select the default texture here. I will select my texture that represents my wall. Here it is. Great. So now I can drag it here to my base color, and I should see it in my main preview. If it doesn't refresh, right click on this and select quad again so that you can see it. Okay, now I want to apply the normal map. So I will drag it here and duplicate this sample texture to this. So I will click Ctrl D to duplicate it, and instead of passing the main texture as the texture input, I will pass here the normal map, and I will now drag the output, so RGB A, so vector 4, as the input of the fragment shader to the normal input. Again, I will refresh my preview. So basically, by adding a normal map, we can apply those sort of details without modifying the geometry of our model or adding more vertices to it. This was a page from Unity Shader Bible by Jetali, and I do recommend this book if you want to learn more about shaders. It will be linked in the description of this video. Okay, back to our shader. Make sure that with the sample texture 2D for the normal map, you select the type and you select normals. And I will select this normal map property of our shader and assign my default normal map for the texture. And I will do the same for the metallic texture so that you can see how different it looks. Okay, and now I will refresh my preview. I'm using Unity 2021.3, and for some reason I have those issues with shader graph. Anyhow, this should have now a bit more details here. We can multiply this by an integer to increase the number of details or the strength of the details. But for now, let's apply the metallic map. I'm going to Ctrl D on the sample texture. I will change this back to the default, assign the metallic map as the texture input or the sample texture input, and I will drag it as my input for the metallic value. This will be about 0 because this is pretty much black, and this should now make my wall less reflective. Okay, so this is how we have our basic texture applied. So now we should have the same effect as we have with our lit shader, maybe a bit less. But for now, we want to save this shader, and we are going to start working on our custom logic to create this paint wall effect. So what we can do is use the UV node, because if we drag it and type split to split it into RGBA values, we can now drag, for example, R and type preview, and we are going to see that it causes this gradation from left to right. But if we drag our G value, it will be gradation from bottom to the top. If we now drag it to a step node and put it as the in value, we can now modify this between 0 and 1, and we can see that we are creating this split between two values, the white value and the black value. So basically we can use this to create our paint mechanic using our custom shader. Now the important part to remember is that we are actually working with vector for values. This white color means that if we multiply it with, for example, our texture, if I multiply this, I can get only part of this texture, and if I multiply the rest of it by a color, or basically get the rest of it and multiply it by the color, I'm going to be able to split it. So what I want to do is paint from the top, so I will multiply this by our texture, and next I will multiply this by a color, so I will press spacebar and type color, and I will select the color node and I will drag it here. So now if I select a red color, we are going to see that the wall is now painted red, so the texture of the wall is now red. So what remains is to get the other half of our texture. So what I will use is the step node output. I will drag it again, but now I will drag it to 1 minus node. And this will give us the other half. Now the important part is that still using this edge, we can move this, so increasing the red color, and now if we multiply the output of this 1 minus, multiply it by our texture, we will see that we can now have the two pieces of our texture. What we can do is add them together, add the colored texture and uncolored one, and now we have our rough version of the wall painting shader. All we need to do is drag it to our base color, and now in the output we should see that we have our shader that allows us to move this edge and create this simple paint wall effect. Now we may want to improve it because right now it doesn't look very organic. But first, let's focus on turning those local values into properties of our shader. So first, let's create a float variable. Then we are going to drag it as the input of our edge, and we are going to right-click on this, convert to a property, and now it will be a property in our blackboard. In the graph inspector, if we select it, we can change the name of it. I will call it paint amount. Okay. So now by default the mode will be slider, and we are going to have a slider from 0 to 1, and I'm going to set it 0.5. So now this is our paint amount that we are going to be able to modify through the script. Next we have this color, so right click on this, convert to property, and this will be our paint color. So I will change it in the graph inspector, the name to be paint color. Okay, great. So we have now those two plus our textures. Now generally we may want to set alpha to be 1, although for the opaque texture it does not matter that much. Now the problem is still that we have this pretty linear split and it does not look very organic. So what we are going to do is we are going to add a gradient. Instead of the step node, we are going to maybe delete it, and let's spacebar find SmoothStep. Okay. So now what we want to do is we want to drag from the preview node to the input our input of the UV, and of course we are going to drag the output to the multiply node. Now as you can see, we have this gradation almost exactly like from the preview of our split of the UVs. So what we want to do is we want to limit the gradation to a small stripe to create this kind of effect that we are painting the top part and the bottom part is still the same color. So what we want to do is we want to modify those edges. If we modify, for example, this to 0.45 and this to 0.55, we can see that we have only this small stripe, this narrow stripe that is that has gradation. The top part is white and the bottom part is black. And that's how we are going to simulate this gradation in our output. Now I will need to drag this SmoothStep output to 1-, and we should now see in the preview the output of our shader. So now this is a bit more organic looking. Now to make this movable, so to tweak those edges through the paint amount, what we can do is assign this paint amount directly to the edge 2 value, and we can drag this paint amount again to the subtract node, and we are going to subtract from it, for example, 0.3, and we are going to drag the output of this as the edge 1, so that we can control through the paint amount. As I drag this, we are going to be able to control this split, so again we can create this mechanic of painting this wall. Now if we want, we can expose it, or we can tweak it through the shader, this offset, and now we can see the preview. So now what we can do is improve it a bit more by multiplying the SmoothStep output. So let me drag it to a multiply node, and we are going to multiply it by 1- result, because this will give us this narrow stripe of values that are in between those two. So this is the gradation stripe that we have originally as the organic way of representing this division between two colors. I'm going to drag those a bit. So now what I want to do is multiply this by a noise. So I'm going to create a simple noise node, and I will set the X value to be about 30, so this basically controls the scale of our noise. If I multiply those two, I will create this noise affected stripe that we can apply to make the shape even more organic. I can multiply it by 20 or by 50 to modify the stripe. It does look a bit better, and now what we can do is multiply the SmoothStep result, or actually subtract from it, we are going to pass the result of our SmoothStep as the A value, and the multiplication result of our noise as the B value. So now we have subtracted this noise from our SmoothStep result, and we have achieved this more organic looking pattern here. Now we can improve it further, but this is pretty much enough for us to create our paint mechanic. So now we can drag our multiplication of the textures, because we now are not going to use the result of our SmoothStep, but rather the result of our subtraction here with the noise value applied. So what we can do is drag here the first part as the multiplication input for our paint color and for our texture actually, and we are going to drag the subtraction result again, type 1-, and now we are going to take the other part, and actually we are going to drag the other part as the input for the multiplication of our texture instead of the previous 1-. Okay, let's save our shader. So now we have this split, and it looks pretty nice, but the problem is that our original texture is always of this white color. So what will happen is, if we try to swap the paint color for something else, we're going to still be working with our original color and this new color. So to prevent this, we need to create in our blackboard another color variable or color property. Let's keep the name color, and this will be our original color by default that's selected in the graph inspector. Let's set it to be white with full alpha, and we are going to first multiply the output of the sample texture 2D of our main texture, multiply this by our color. So now we can use this as the input of our original texture, so this. So I'm going to drag this multiplication output to the input of our first multiplication by our default texture, and for the multiplication for the color, we are going to leave the same connection to the original texture color. So thanks to this, if we now select our color and change the value to be red, we are now changing the value between the green and the red, and if we change the paint color, for example to this blue, we are going to apply a new color over the old color. If we save our color, so if we drag our paint amount to be 1, we are going to have this backwards, because now if we set to the 0, we are going to see the blue color. So if we have this full blue color, we can save this as the color of our original color. And now if we change the paint amount to be 1, we are going to set the color of the paint color to be something else. We are going to be able to paint our wall to another color. So now let's set the color, the original color, to be white. But the issue that we have is that if we set our amount to 1, we are going to have the minimum value of the color, and the 0 will set the color to be full, but it would be more intuitive if it was other way around. So what we can do is we can go to where we are applying our paint amount value, and we can set our paint amount to 0.5. And let's swap the input for our SmoothStep. So let's drag the paint amount as the edge 1 and subtract value as edge 2. So now our black and white colors were swapped. Okay, but there will be another issue that right now, if we do that, our paint amount indeed works as expected, but if we select our quad here, it changes from the bottom towards the top. So if you can see here better, if we modify our value, it goes from the bottom towards the top, but probably it would be more natural to see it appear at the top first and then goes towards the bottom. So to fix this, we want to first get the 1 minus of our UV output. So from the preview, we are going to drag 1 minus, and we are going to drag this into a SmoothStep. And now we should have this working. So if we take out here, we're going to see that our paint amount will go from 0 to 1, and this should work properly. Now, one more issue that we may have is that if we have default value 1, we are not going to have the full texture painted. So this is an issue, and what we can do with this is in turn remap our paint amount. So let's drag this to the remap node as the input. Okay. And now we are going to first remap our paint value from 0 to 1 to be from 0 to, for example, 1.3 or 1.2, because basically this offset that we have in the subtract node will affect how much of the texture is painted. So we will drag this remap output to the subtract and remap output as the edge 1 of our SmoothStep. And now this should cause this to be fully painted even when our paint amount is 1, and if we set 0, it is nothing is painted, and now we are going to have this smooth painting solution for our wall. So just to recap, what we did is first we have applied those textures, and this should be pretty clear. Now here we have taken the UV, we have split it and taken the G value, and we have used 1 minus to get the correct input. We have used paint amount float value from 0 to 1 on the remap node and get it from 0 to 1.2, and we have used subtract node to get this narrow strip of gradation between the white and black color using the SmoothStep. We have applied those subtract and the paint amount as the edge 1 and edge 2, and we have used 1 minus to get the stripe, and we have used the multiplication and used the noise as the second parameter to get this more organic shape. And we have used again subtract from our SmoothStep this noise stripe, so we have this result. And we are using this and 1 minus to multiply this by our texture twice. And now one of those we need to multiply by the color that we want to apply of our paint, and we add those together to create the result, the base color of our shader. Great, so let's save this, and if we go back to Unity, we're going to be able to right click on the shader graph and create a material, and this will be our new material. If I select my scene, my object, and I drag here our shader material, we will see that now if I select the material and drag the paint amount, we're going to see that now we can paint our wall. Now the idea here is again that if we have painted our wall, I'm going to set this yellow color as the color, and I'll change the paint value to be something else. First, let's decrease the paint amount, and I will change this to, for example, green. And now I can paint green over the yellow color, as you can see, and it can be indefinitely set through the script. The color can be set to something else, and all we need to do is to remember to save this as we exit the game and reapply it to our shaders of each wall that is painted. I will post another video showing how to integrate this shader using a custom script so that the players will be able to paint walls using this custom shader. Great! I will try to post the full shader as an image and I will link it in the description of this video. If you have enjoyed this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, let me know what you think about this shader. See you in the next video.